welcome again. I think everybody here, but Lacey was upstairs. We're good to see everyone. And Walter, this was genius putting us in this room and making it look like a full house. Yeah. We have our speaker today, Laceye Warner from Duke Divinity School. Lacey, she is the best speaker we have had at one of these, and we have had some great speakers. Yeah. And so we are really fortunate to have her come up from Duke. She is a luminary in her field, and well, you don't want to listen to me. Lacey, it's all yours.
Well, you're very kind. Well, welcome. I am delighted to be here. It gives me such joy to talk about history. And then, do you realize that we're in the county in which this person is laid to rest? So I have been thrilled about putting this talk together. Now, full disclosure, most of the talk comes from a chapter in a book that was published with Baylor University Press many years ago, not quite 20, but it was my first.
I forgot to mention it. You want to hold it up?
Since we're taping, I won't recommend or not recommend. It's a little expensive, so
it's worth every penny.
You'll have what you need on the video and in the handouts, as well as, of course, to support. And this sounds odd to be recorded and say, but it did get some recognition with an award. So I did my best there. But to translate that out into material that can be, received and recognized and even digested into our current context. I've tried to do that, which, as you know, is not the easiest with history. But the story sometimes is the powerful thread that holds us together. Okay, so y'all look so very attentive. Are you comfortable? Can you see me? Not really. If I'm going to move just a little. If it stays in this.
Too hot, too cold, let me know.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you all have handouts. Okay, so I can do a proper lecture where I talk in modulated tones and go line by line. But if you will allow me, I would rather keep mostly eye contact and visit my notes and read quotes or sort of significant, carefully composed statements to describe more complicated features. I'm going to say that it's okay to ask questions as we go. If you will look at the outline and see how it goes, particularly if you see something that's not going to be covered, that means I might not know, but I can look and try to find out. Okay, so I'm going to...
But if your questions get us off topic, you know how I am.
Yes, and I have my phone here solely for time. Is lunch at noon?
Lunch is scheduled for noon, but
okay. Great.
Use your own judgment.
Okay, well, and I will also, the eye contact is important because then we will judge together. If you begin to, I pick up on nonverbals, yeah. Or, all right, we're good, thanks so much. Okay, so the first handout that has this title, Christian Advocate and Journal and Zion's Herald. That's the publication in which Dorothea Ripley's obituary appears. So I wanted you to have that first. And I'm used to students multitasking. So you have some things that you can shift around. She's described as an extraordinary woman. And when I saw that line, which I hadn't seen the obituary, it wasn't accessible to me when I wrote the book, when that publication came out. So I thought this was very instructive and inspiring, and we're just going to make sure. So what we're doing is we're beginning at the end. So Dorothea Ripley, 1767 to 1831, and you'll have a sense of the implications of that time frame, and I'll make a few points about it. Died on Friday, the 23rd of December, at the residence of William Green, Mecklenburg County, Virginia, not Charlotte. Virginia. Dorothea Ripley, perhaps the most extraordinary woman in the world. And you can go on to read more if you would like, and that's for your reference. I'm going to put mine here. Okay, so here are a few highlights. Nope, here's context. We'll get to the highlights in a moment. Here's a statement from my perspective of the significance of Dorothea Ripley. Ripley's ministry among enslaved persons and their owners substantially predates the American Anti-Slavery Society, which convened in December 1833, and then the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women held 3 annual sessions from 37 to 39. The Grimke's were involved here. So Dorothea Ripley she passes in 1831, and she's very active, particularly from 1801. I think just about up until her death, but there might be some quiet time right there towards the end. So significance is she's working, practicing ministry, itinerating on her own as a single woman, visiting with all sorts of folks, including President Jefferson, very boldly, and also among enslaved persons, among the incarcerated, and among those in power that are exercising that systemic, keeping that systemic system in power, right? So she also visits with the owners of enslaved persons and, strategically, I think, the children of those owners of persons. So she just has an amazing mind, if you see what I mean, in terms of thinking about, here she's called to ministry, which we'll talk about that, but I wanted to begin at the end, sort of say, look, here's her context, here are things that she accomplished and she practiced during her lifetime, and then we can move through and we can focus on ones that you're most interested in, particularly if we are stewarding our time, if you hear what I mean, okay? Okay, all right, so now, highlights. So this is going to mostly reflect the highlights on the handout. I did do one more recently than the other. So highlights include, she's born in, well, you know what? I'm going to go through the handout. Ripley's ministry substantially predates, okay, so born in Whitby, England. She's the daughter of Reverend William Ripley, and we'll talk about him for a bit if we have time and you want to hear. William Ripley was a Methodist preacher, and he overlaps with John Wesley. John Wesley even comments on Ripley after his death. So Ripley is encouraging, like actually encouraging, not implicitly encouraging, directly and stated encouraging of his daughter Dorothy to preach. So this is quite, we can talk about that, the nuance of all that and how Wesley was permissive, but he wasn't necessarily approving of women preachers. So it's a careful statement there. She traveled extensively across the Atlantic. She traveled extensively, including across the Atlantic 8 or 9 times. That depends on who you look at. Paul Chilcote, I think, had a higher number. I've seen lower numbers, and I'm not critiquing. Paul was my inspiration for this, so I'm very grateful to Professor Chilcote. This is me managing expectations as a historian. So I went through her primary sources, whereas Dr. Chilcote has a book over, he surveys and basically what you call inventories. I don't mean that as a commodity, but like he looks at the range of women that appear in the Methodist movement during a certain time period, and then I'm going deeply into Dorothy. So, okay. She interviews with President Jefferson in 1802 to discuss enslavement of persons. That's quite an exchange if we want to do that. She preached among Native peoples, incarcerated persons, and before the U.S. Congress. She's probably the first woman to do that in 1806. And then her doctrinal frame is clearly a Wesleyan emphasis on universal atonement. All right, so you can see, I get a little excited. How's the speed? You okay? Okay, all right, if you just need to put like pause or slow down, since we can do that now on some things, I will try. Just please tell me. Okay. So I thought it might be helpful to see a list of her publications. They're included in the chapter, but there's so many, and here they are in order, supposedly. I mean, because it's a bit difficult to track down because there weren't electronic, encyclopedic AI sort of possibilities. Is this a revision later on? Because some of the publications are revised and reissued, and it is for fundraising. I mean, this did help her support herself in ministry. So she has letters addressed to Dorothea Ripley. These are letters people have written her about her ministry, and I don't know that we'll get to this later, but to say that they're not all positive, which I find really intriguing, that she's publishing letters of accountability to demonstrate her learning curve, right? So this particularly one, it's from an incarcerated person that she visited, and he sees her talking to someone else, and he comments, he writes, he says, "Thank you so much for coming and all the wonderful things that she did. And I noticed that in your exchange, you seem to assume the guilt of this other party." He says, "How do we know that?" And so she writes a comment in the letters in the publication that says, "That is absolutely right. I needed to hear that, and here's how I changed." So I thought that was really inspiring. Okay, so letters, the extraordinary conversion and religious experience of Dorothea Ripley. This is her spiritual memoir, part 1. The Bank of Faith and Works United is basically her spiritual memoir, part 2. So those are very long and very detailed, and a lot about her visions. The account of Rose Butler in 1819 is an account of her accompanying as a chaplain a young woman, an enslaved girl in 1819, who set fire to her mistress's home, is the language. So she was charged with arson, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. And so Dorothy accompanies Rose, and it's a bit graphic. She doesn't publish it as a Yes, as a voyeur, as a sort of shock value, because she's a bit restrained on it, but she's a bit restrained, and the purpose of it is an account and an argument against capital punishment. So it's not completely grounded in theological theory, there's some natural law in there, but the point is she is making a case about abolition of capital punishment based on her experiences here, and based on, there needs to be time for someone to understand and repent and be at peace with everyone in God. Okay, an address to all in difficulties. This one I haven't gotten a hold of, and then more memoirs of William Ripley. So she writes after her father's death about the encouragement and the virtue of her dad. Okay, so publications. Any questions? No? Okay, here we go. Next.
Are you going to go into her kind of mystical experiences, or you said she had visions?
She did, yeah.
Did they pertain to slavery, or were they just?
Okay, so I was not, because there were these long quotes, and I wondered if we would be in a room with you sitting looking at me. But if the group is in agreement, I can give you a paragraph, because you can see my responses are not going to be sound bites, and that's just where I am in life. Okay, so I can comment and I can combine if there's another interest.
Well, it's the previous slide, when you listed her publications, did she find publishers in New York or in a northern state?
Oh, yes.
Boston or someplace?
Yes.
It's very unusual, first off, for a woman to be publishing books. And secondly, with these topics, I'm sure she ran into some difficulties in finding someone who would publish.
Exactly, yes. Your comment is very welcome, and others or additional ones are, and I haven't forgotten.
Yeah.
So this list of publications is from Paul Chilcote. He had a longer list than I had, but I have some different I have some slightly different, so her Extraordinary Conversion, I have an 1810 version that I located on microfilm, and it was published in New York by G&R Waite in 1810. So she did talk at length about my spiritual visions, and one in particular is about her feeling called very strongly to minister across the ocean and to persons of African descent who were being held against their will. And so it's quite excessive language, very flowery, very flourished, and phrase after phrase, and it's still the same sentence, right? Like it's on and on and on. So very much flow of consciousness. And a point later, so I can do linear, but so many things interact. So she, to me, and I'm Methodist, United Methodist, she's Methodist to her core. She's really Wesleyan, but there are some nuances of the time that lead her to be independent. And we can get to that, but one of the pieces, she's so anti-slavery and pro-women's preaching, and that's all Methodist, but her visions, but that's also Quaker, and the pro-preaching part ebbs and flows, because Wesley dies. I have all this very carefully crafted, but Wesley dies, and then they withdraw. There were probably 1,000 women preaching at Wesley's death. Not all Methodist, but many. I don't know that there would be a simple majority. So the Quakers are the place to go if you're a woman who is called to preach. And so she was seeking support and credentialing, I don't know, not really credentialing as a license, but as some support. So her visions, which are beautiful and dramatic, and they're both in dreams. It's all fine.
Make sure I turn mine off.
I'm in there.
So it seems to me that a lot of these women who are working on reform saw that as an outflow of sanctification.
Yes.
And I recall so many of them in finding their call to leadership or to a voice in this, nearly all of them that I recall had some kind of vision
Yes.
that called them to voice and leadership.
Yes, and they're following that call, which seems so very bold and brave, is also out of a sense of, I mean, now we might say a bit of anxiety, about a concern, agitation about their own salvation. That if they feel so driven and called because they've had these visions, whether in dreams or in prayer, which Dorothy had them both. So I'm like both and consistently. I mean, the Extraordinary Conversion and the Bank of Faith. I mean, they're hundreds of pages long, if I'm remembering correctly, and it's, I didn't read them yesterday for our talk. I was trying to get kind of a higher level. But then we'd be here for a long time. There would be no lunch because we would fast with Dorothea Ripley. No, we wouldn't. I'm joking. Okay, so her, these women's visions, and particularly Dorothy's, which were very, very precise, because some are about, like say Mary Wollstonecraft Fletcher. Hers are very much about being in ministry and doing things that are out of the ordinary, but I don't recall that she was called to preach precisely in her vision, whereas Dorothy Ripley is called, she has, and you know how we document things, the way she documents and describes these visions, I mean, you just can't help but think, oh my gosh, she really heard a voice from God and saw something before her that said, you need to get on that boat and go and find that president and tell him what for, and then, keep going, and so hers feels like almost a step-by-step lesson plan, if you will. So it's in beautiful language. It has all of this imagery, biblical imagery of various mythical biblical creatures, and the voice of God, and it's her being explicitly called to these specific ministries, which I thought was really distinctive, if not unique, among the women I looked at that then the selection of those in the book.
Which was counter to the expectations of women at that time.
Completely. Yes, yeah. All of these women risk their lives almost on a daily basis. So Dorothea Ripley was on her own and in the midst. And Julia Foote tells more about her encountering danger than Dorothy does. I think Dorothy, we're all distinctive, right? Like we all have our own complexity and wonderful, beautiful gifts. And so for Dorothy, I just think she was oblivious. I think she's like, this is what I'm gonna do, and this is what God has called me to. And if it doesn't work out, I'll be with God. Now that's very abrupt, but I think that's where she was, where not everyone was in that same spot. Okay, how are we doing?
There was in the broader social, I know you've got to get through this, but there was, in the broader social context in which she was living,
Yeah, yeah.
in the 1820s, it's like a powder keg that's starting to build through the 1820s, and you had Nat Turner's revolt at the beginning of, literally, when she died. And then you had the anti-slavery movement, and you had you had Andrew Jackson being elected president. So culturally and politically, there was a lot of, it was very dynamic at that point. So it doesn't surprise me that she was in that firmament of
Yes.
turmoil.
Yes, and that she traveled across into New York City, down to Washington, D.C., and then to have relatives here in Mecklenburg County, and to be traveling in the South at this time. A, doing anti-slavery work in the South, and then B, doing it as a woman was really extraordinary.
But I can see the literature of the time, especially newspaper articles, which were famous to being going on and on and on, and there's no such thing as a short newspaper article in those days. And women had, I sense they were restricted, their entertainment, of course they had TV and all that, with novels, romantic novels, were probably high on the list. So if you take the reality that you're talking about, that powder keg of political,
right,
social thing, and you take a woman who reads these novels, these romantic novels, and tries to put herself into that world in some logical way, and whether those visions that she had were just a manifestation of those two worlds coming together. I mean, I can see that happen, especially somebody who had a tremendous amount of imagination and spirit, that they would create a woman. That environment could create a woman, especially if she's been held back in a lot of ways. It's just, I got to charge forth. There's the only way I can do this. To get to that romantic novel stage is to charge forth.
Absolutely, yes.
I was just thinking too, how unusual for a woman in Virginia to be so anti-slavery. What was her experience with slavery? You said that did her family own slaves? Did she?
All right, that's a lovely segue. Now, it's going to be a minute before I get there.
Oh, okay.
Is that okay? No, it's perfect. Because she's reading about it, she's hearing about it. And I have material. So first, can I tell you about her dad briefly? But that leads into okay. So her father, William Ripley, encourages her to preach. He's exiled from his home at 19 because he listens to Wesley's preachers. And then he does tour with Wesley as a preacher. So he's a Methodist preacher, he's bivocational. He farms and does other things, but is not a landowner in Whitby, England. And if you've been to Whitby, do you know as I look at the camera, the Stoker's Dracula, and there's a movie, a film, and there's ruins of Whitby Abbey on the outcrop into the North Sea. That's Whitby. So it's very hilly, it's extremely cold and rainy, it's very extreme, just small and intense. Okay, so this is where Ripley is raised and where she grows up. The father, when he finally passes away, and Dorothy's mother really feels like William preaches too much out of doors and in this inclement weather, and and falls ill and dies. And so Wesley does give this positive, oh, you don't have that. Yes, on the handout, Wesley says, for many years of burning in a shining light. Okay, so we have the father's influence. To get to what she experienced about slavery, here we go. So she's in, while Ripley's, okay, so her anti-slavery views are very much informed by her being Methodist and hanging out with, spending time with Quakers there, and we talked about women's ministry at the time and how the Methodists withdrew support after John Wesley's death. So she describes her unfolding divine commission from the age of 12 to minister among enslaved Africans in America. So her vocation expands. So we've talked about the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. During the 1820s, speaking publicly against slavery in the American South had grown nearly impossible and provoked imprisonment and even violence. Her experience is mainly from reading and from hearing, and here I do have notes and footnotes on the British slave trade was abolished in 1807. So that wouldn't have happened overnight. There would have been a lot of, she would have been living in the midst of the increasing pressure to abolish the slave trade in Great Britain. It was finally dismantled formally in 1833 as a result of converging anti-slavery momentum. So this takes decades. And you know the Quakers led among Christians in anti-slavery reform throughout. In addition to Methodists, and the founders of American Methodism, Asbury and Coke, held firm to the British anti-slavery position. So she wouldn't have experienced it firsthand until she came to the US. And then she, by her own, like people said, no, you don't want to do that. And she said, no, I do. And so she went, and whether, she always had like a carriage or a horse, like she was chaperoned, what is it, like hosted. She would have had someone with her most of the time, but they would have had an opinion about where she wanted to go, right? So there was a lot of convincing to say, no, I want to go and I want to see. And that's how she initiated the encounters with slave owners, with enslaved persons, with incarcerated and others, and then with the children. So that was all by her very strategic and consistent, I want to say pestering, right? Like her persistence. I mean, she just,
over here a lot.
like politely, in the context of what she knew as social convention, and because she didn't have necessarily leverage or social status as a single woman particularly without like one Christian community,
But she was like, wouldn't you say she was like Frances Willard in that she saw what was available to her as a door to take her message, that women were available to her, and
Yes.
children and enslaved people, and so
yes.
whereas her message may not be
Good
well
point.
received, that was
Yeah.
one stepping stone.
Yes, because there would have been categories of places where she would have entry and be at home. So yes, that's a really good point. Yeah.
You said that she confronted slave owners.
Yeah.
As a woman in Virginia or in the South at that time, wasn't that pretty dangerous? Did she ever,
Yes.
was she ever, I don't know, not attacked, but, well, she may have been for all I know, but,
She would.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, I'm wondering how she dealt with that. I mean, to confront a slave owner and say, you're wrong, you're terrible, you're being awful to these people. And as a woman, I just find that amazing.
Yes.
I can't imagine how she had the nerve, I guess.
Right. So when we think about autobiography, we know that it's not a historical primary source, right? It's it is a kind of historical primary source, but it is not necessarily. It's through the lens
It's not
of
objective.
somebody's perspective and what they think they're communicating and what they hope somebody, the audience wants to receive. And so we don't have it's not a diary, which would be closer, but still not precise. And so I just have her accounts and the letters and, you know, so the publications that I mentioned, and a few, I was saying, and public record, right, that corroborates this, at least the time and date and location of the situation. So she was in dangerous situations. She doesn't, to my memory, really go into a lot of detail of her fear or dynamics of it, but she does describe settings that I can only imagine, like they've got to be really, really fraught. But because women there's such a strong network of women in church communities across, and she did feel relatively at home in most any Christian community. Like that was a part of her support. And you know, that's a really helpful context, because there's all sorts of pieces about legalities for the time and how, in response to conflicts of interest among slave owners related to whether the notion of conversion and baptism of slaves might lead to their emancipation. There's a series of laws enacted, and it's in the 1600s in Maryland, New York, Virginia, to protect the property rights of slave owners who hold these enslaved persons, that whether or not they can be Christianized. So that's another, even if it's technically legal on the books, it's still a thread going through. So
How did she respond to Christian slaveholders? I mean, that would have been,
okay,
if she felt so strongly about it.
yes,
Yet she
so
herself was so religious.
let's
I'm
go
sorry, am I
to,
jumping?
all right, so if we can put a pin in this and get to it just after I go into a bit more detail about whether she was Methodist or Quaker. Can we do that? And then I have a ministry vignette, and I will tell you exactly what she said. Well, exactly what she said to President Jefferson, which I find really fun. It's not a long exchange, but there are some words. They had words. She did not back down. Okay, so we have William Ripley. This is great. And you had a question too.
Well, I don't know that I should be cutting into your airtime.
Or a comment. Are you sure?
Pardon?
Okay, jump in.
Well, the quick question, a slave wrote a petition, right? Was it Virginia or Maryland, saying that since they were baptized, they should be indicted? And these laws that were passed by these assemblies were a response to that petition.
Yeah, so there's a turning over. I didn't give you like the whole, but yes, so we have, great, you can be the expert.
Was that Virginia or Maryland? Who wrote it?
I think it's
You don't remember?
Virginia. But
I thought so too, but.
I will, that was in a piece that I revisited to make sure I knew, as we came. So I will trust the wisdom. There's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in this group, so we're doing this all together. Okay, so are you interested in the Methodist Quaker dynamic?
Yes.
Okay, so I had to dig on this. I didn't find this anywhere else, so I'm giving you my account, and I'm trying to be as measured as possible with the understanding that I am Methodist, and I'd really love for her to feel at home there. Ripley insisted that she did not hold membership in any specific tradition. With that said, she did feel rapport with Asbury, Koch, and others that she met that were active in Methodism at the time, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and I think that there's a way in which she discerned, and I can do this with closer notes, that she discerns that having one place would cut her off from other places, and while it brings some safety, that not that it was necessarily in her visions, but in her prayers, that she thought that it was more faithful for her to go on faith, right? More faithful, to go on faith and to have God lead her way and not necessarily lean on the protection of necessarily a Christian community per se. So she boldly asserts her Christian faith. She has affinity, most of her affinities are with Methodists and then with Quakers. And I've explained a little bit how she recounted attending local Quaker meetings and feeling at home, but her vision, she says she felt at home. So I'm just gonna pause right there. Her visions were quite dramatic, which was not comfortable for the Quakers. So this is possibly one of the reasons why they're like, yeah, we think you're lovely. You can stay with us anytime. We'll help get you around. We agree with you, we support you, but we're not going to admit. When she petitioned more than once to become a member, and I said, no, we're not sure that's the right fit for you. But I don't think that it was out of exclusion. I think that there's a sense that you have a theological home, right? Like, yes, your father's passed, and in England, the British Methodists are not as hospitable to women in this era, but over the long arc, if you will, like there are kindred spirits for you. So they were welcoming, but not permitting a membership, the Quakers. And then Methodists, it was really her own, right? The Methodists were welcoming, and they embraced her, but she just really had the sense that Methodists didn't go far enough. And it's particularly, I think, she didn't write this down, but if we're looking at the time frames, right? And we're thinking about this context and the situations of what is it like to be a woman preacher during this time in the midst of abolition and anti-slavery. As Francis Asbury passes away in 1816, am I close?
Right.
Yeah, okay, because I teach that class too, but we're here today. I'm like all about Dorothy. Okay, so as Francis Asbury passes, then the strength of the Methodist witness against slavery weakens. Because it's slowly erosion of, can somebody be a part of a class meeting if they own persons? It's like, well, we want them to have a community.
Maybe this would be a good
Okay.
time to comment on
Sure.
this, because
Okay.
this part of the world where you're standing right now
Yes.
is a strong factor in that.
Yeah.
This was part of cotton raising plantation areas, this extra section of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, after slaves were no longer allowed to be imported into America, Virginia was one of the largest slave breeding places in America, and Richmond was the second largest slave market. Meanwhile, when she arrived in America, the great revival of the Old Brunswick Circuit in this region, there were more Methodists in Virginia here than there were anywhere else in the country. The revival was greater than anything Wesley had seen. But the more people who became Methodists in the revival, the more slave owners joined Methodist churches. And so at first, in 1784, there were few enough slaveholders where they could hold their feet to the fire on the slavery legislation. But there were so many, largely from this neighborhood, that were slaveholders that they just did not have the votes to keep an anti-slavery rule for Methodists.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Very helpful context from right here. Yeah. So the development, the emergence, and the shrinking, the shadow of the strong particularity of a witness in a smaller denomination or a smaller community than larger than the influences and the strategies change. So a last point about her connections to neither Methodist or Quaker is to just talk about the doctrinal consistency with Methodists. So if we went back to her spiritual memoirs, I spend pages and pages in the book, and then I have more pages in the files about her visions demonstrate Wesley's Via Salutis. That's the short version. So coming to faith, understanding prevenient grace, into justification, even some struggles, possibly backsliding, but a clear sense, deep sense of justification and experience of that. Then moving into sanctification, and so she experiences sanctification as participating in the doctrine of sanctification as Wesley would describe it, and then has this amazing entire sanctification experience. experience. So she is with whatever layers there are in terms of autobiographical theory, her precision and her affinity for Methodist doctrine is just, it's very, very clear. It's very, very clear in both of those spiritual memoirs, both the early and the late. And she adds on with the experience of entire sanctification. So her neither Methodist nor Quaker stance is really about her independence and her witness in the midst of a particular time and place and community, but there are ways in which she doesn't ever really leave her Methodist identity behind, right? It's not that she doesn't identify or embody or profess those doctrines any longer. Okay, how are we doing? Oh, okay, President Jefferson, shall we? That might be a nice way to wrap up. Okay, so presidential interview. I have some really lovely dialogue that she recounts. If just give me a second to find it. So she sails, and this is her first trip from England, and I have dates and oh, here it is. Okay, so Ripley embarks on her first itinerant evangelistic tour with confidence and hope for the salvation of souls and bodies captive to the systemic sin of slavery. She departs on her first voyage to the U.S. from Bristol on the 13th of February, 1802. Just get it here. Yes. See, she'd been very at home. I mean, in a way, she's familiar because it's like Whitby. But yes, it's been so cold. So the name of the ship is the brig Triton. It was sailed by Captain Gilbert Howland, a Quaker. See, so she's very much a networker in the best possible way. Okay, after a rugged crossing, I need a moment right there. The ship arrived in the New World at Rhode Island, April 1st. Despite advice to the contrary from ministers and elders of a Philadelphia Quaker meeting, Ripley immediately turns her journey to Washington, D.C. So she arrives, she's got this winter crossing, rugged. I can't imagine what that would have been like. She arrives in Rhode Island. She has a place to stay, very nice people, mostly Quaker throughout the journey down to Washington, D.C. And she's like, no, take me to D.C. And I'm like, are you serious? She's like, yeah, I'm so serious. So it took some convincing. But Ripley planned to obtain an appointment with the President of the United States. And can you imagine people in polite society? You know, we're sort of, what are we like? Middle class, Christian sect a bit. Like, oh, that's a nice idea. Like, I hope that works for you. And she said, quote, "For the Lord required me to go on to Washington City that very day to have an interview with the President. So I told them it would have been pleasant to me if I could have taken their advice, but I must obey God and not man," end quote. So Ripley tenaciously claims that the meeting with the President was a specific part of her evangelistic vocation, going back to those visions. Quote, "According to my faith from this weighty testimony that awed my mind all the way previous to my visit." Okay, so she does not adhere well to the confining gender expectations of the time, moving intentionally and often alone within the public and private spheres when somebody wouldn't keep up. This may have been the result of her perception of an equality of spirit received through conversion, but there are footnotes there. Okay, so Ripley arrives in Washington just before dark on May 4th. So she arrives in Rhode Island April 1st, she's in Washington May 4th with a letter of recommendation, which she delivered immediately. In the process, Ripley came across a gathering of the nation's leaders, and I just imagine, right, like you're walking the streets, trying to avoid, stepping in something difficult. And she sees a group of folks standing outside, probably one of these, probably not the same buildings, right, but the predecessors to these grand buildings. the most helpful of which was Secretary of State James Madison, whose wife Dolly extended Ripley an invitation for lodging. General Dearborn, Secretary of War, was also a part of this. So Dearborn offered to accompany Ripley to see the president. So they're standing outside chit-chatting, right? Probably after some dinner or reception, and they see this woman, maybe alone because she shook her driver, like her carriage person. That's not the technical term, but and then she's like, oh, you know, I don't even like, would she have recognized them, or would she have just felt the spirit say, hey, these are folks that might be helpful to you? And then there's a woman in the group, because I always this is off notes, but like I have a child, I have a daughter, and we have talked over the years, like, well, what do I do if I'm lost or I'm in trouble? What do? You find a mom. You find a woman. Yeah, so I just, extra. Okay, so Ripley, she says, so the Lord was gracious to me in preparing the way thus far. So Ripley visits the president the following morning, because she's got this letter, she gets an appointment. You can see she just keeps moving, and maybe there's not all the same layers of security at the moment. So Ripley visits the president the following morning with several others, including Dearborn. Vice President Aaron Burr made the introductions. I mean, just to think what happens behind the scenes, that she's stirred all this up. After which President Jefferson received all into his sitting room, and according to Ripley, this is what she says about it. She's like, he listened to my tale of woe with an exclamation point. So I don't know what layers of irony to put upon there. Ripley recounted her words to the president. Quote, my concern was at present for the distressed Africans, that I felt disposed to lay aside my own ease and happiness to put forth an effort to promote theirs if possible. She then reveals the purpose for her visit. She goes, right, I mean, this is her account, right? I wish to have thy approbation before I move one step in the business, understanding thou art a slaveholder, end quote.
What I'm hearing, from a female perspective, of course, is that she has a goal and she's moving towards it. And she knows that if she takes time to rest or to do anything, the men will organize and put the roadblocks in place. And so she's just pushing ahead and doing, and just continually, that continual movement, just it creates its own momentum.
It does, yes. And with the Spirit, you know, when we have a sense of what the Spirit's calling and how the Spirit is moving others, you just keep going. Yeah, that is wonderful. That's a beautiful image. I love that. And to see that, so she has this clear commission. It's in the visions. She thinks, you know, she's called to see the president. So talking to the president first, who's a slaveholder. She's like, I just wanted you to know what I'm going to be up to, and like, let me just lay it all out here, and then I'm heading out into your space to preach this gospel that I've received. So she kind of has this, she has a really interesting sense of political action and social change that may be commensurate with the time, but for a woman to participate in that with few partners is pretty interesting. So, okay, so let's see.
Who was her letter of introduction from?
I don't know, and if I could find out, that would be on the top of my list. Yeah.
I mean, I thought that would be interesting.
Wouldn't it? Yes, so I'm not sure, because she seemed to have a letter of recommendation from between Rhode Island and Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And that's what I haven't been able to track it down. And if you can track it down, please let me know, and I'll do the same. Yeah, so it's like, is it, like, what kind, is it you see where the questions could go from there?
Right.
Yeah, yes.
I may have missed something in the questions that were asked, but do you know whether in Thomas Jefferson's letters, his writings, whether she is mentioned?
My short answer is no. My longer answer is I haven't found it, or I haven't found somebody who has found it.
I was just curious.
Yeah, I like that question. Yes.
Well, I think that given the role of women at that time, She was probably, oh, we'll just appease her and say, okay, and then
Yeah,
set
yeah.
her aside.
You can preach to Congress, like eventually, like that was several years later, because she's clearly a fixture on the landscape after this. She doesn't shy. So the president does respond at this confrontation, because Ripley's revealing her agenda without too sharply confronting the president's complicity in slavery, but directly addressing his complicity. And so to this, she says the president bowed his head and replied, I can see it so probably not eye contact. You have my approbation, and I wish you success, but I'm afraid you will find it an arduous task to undertake. End quote.
Which underscores what you just said,
Yeah.
we'll appease
We'll
this
appease
little
the
lady
little
and,
girl.
yeah.
And so Ripley replies and says, then I have thy approbation. And at this, the president rises and performs the same ceremony over, repeating nearly the same sentence he had already done. And then he makes a statement, which I don't think I will repeat, but is predictable and consistent with Enlightenment philosophy of the time. So of a kind of hierarchy of creatures, of a hierarchy of creation. And so Ripley counters this, clearly not grounded in scripture or Imago Dei statement from Jefferson, with the words, God had made all nations of one blood, end quote. So, I mean, she's really in there. I mean, she's just critical theological reflection in the midst of embodied practices that are bold and courageous, following these calls, these commissions, and the Spirit's direction. So receiving consent.
That phrase would have been a good fit for the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, we should go back and that one. Okay, so I have a bit more. She says they parted in peace. Yeah, so let's see. Receiving his consent, Ripley expresses to the president particularly concern for women of African descent, and they talk about that for a bit. And he actually, she pushes him on how many persons does he hold in slavery, and he informs her, according to her, that he had a certain number, say 300, but the number is decreased. It's decreased. Ripley determined that it was a seasonable time to signify how her nature was shocked to hear of the souls and bodies being exposed to sale, and she implored his pity and commiseration. So they probably had even more exchange, and then she says they parted in peace. So there's all sorts of things we could unpack about her interaction with the president, and as I mentioned, she was invited. Jefferson permitted her to preach to Congress in the Hall of Representatives, and that occurred on a subsequent tour in January 1806. Oh no, sorry. I'm getting my dates a little mixed up. Anyway, she was invited to preach in Congress, then she also addressed Maryland legislators and then the U.S. Congress. So there are layers and layers of her speaking to people, which is interesting, which it would have been, so going back to Frances Willard or to Helen Merritt Montgomery, there are ways in which women who are very persuasive and impactful, that they are pushed into leadership roles where they address large groups, but it's much less effective because it's isolated. It's almost like consolation prizes, if you follow me. Okay. So that is our vignette of Dorothea Ripley's interview with President Jefferson. She accomplished so much in her time, and I just want to wrap up.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Did she make any inroads with the Madisons when he came to the presidency? You said Dolly invited her.
Right. There is a little bit more about Dolly in places, but I'm not remembering it as substantial. So there could be more there to look for in between the spiritual visions. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember when Jefferson's wife died. Does anybody know?
Oh, early.
It was early.
Yeah.
So she's talking to him as a widower, and now, of course, in the words of Paul Harvey, we know the rest of the story about him and Sally, and so there's a little bit of irony that I imagine Jefferson had a poker face on that.
And Ripley asked directly about, not necessarily about an individual.
Right, but she was touching on something she had no specific idea that he personally was.
Indeed, yeah, yes.
I have a quick question before you wrap up.
Okay.
Why did you go back to England so often? Why did you go back and forth? I mean, that's pretty unusual at that time.
It
It's
is.
expensive too.
It is, and just, exhausting, the fatigue and the endurance that it would take.
Dangerous.
And very dangerous. And so the reasons I see, and I'm glad to have others add or expand or correct, is she felt called, so if she had siblings at home, if there's her mother that's still alive and then passes, she has siblings, that she feels some responsibility, and so she feels torn between her divine callings and her relationships, her family, and her responsibilities as, if not the eldest sister, then a sister among.
Did she go back to get more money from him?
And then, so they were not necessarily financial resources, but whenever there is travel back and forth, there was a dynamic, I think, between the U.S. and Great Britain, maybe still, that you travel here and then come home and tell the stories, and then travel there and come home and tell the stories, and but there is some fruitfulness to that.
Would the War of 1812 had any impact on our ministry?
I don't know, because it gets, the timing, again, like, it's just a little spotty, her chronology.
And what about her finances? Where did she get the money for this travel? She might have had to go back to England just to get the benefactors to.
Fair, yes, and the publications, and then that there were publications, I believe, on both sides. And so that was a source of, at least occasional, because many people would publish their accounts and then sort of hand them out at events. She was less likely to do that, but she did have publishers, so yes.
I kind of wonder if
Was she buried?
if her discussion with Thomas Jefferson affected him enough that later on he did free his slaves earlier than many others. I sort of wonder he got invited and do that.
What a lovely wondering. So I don't know precisely where she is buried, but I'm thrilled to be within the same county in which she is buried. And if anyone knows or finds her place of rest, I would love to know.
Did she die in the United States?
She died in this county.
Oh, and she died here in Mexico. You did say that.
In her,
oh, you saw that in the obituary. That's right. But you don't know where her grave is.
I do not know. Like, I just found this out, I think after your invitation.
Oh.
So I was thinking, I wonder, Dorothea Ripley is all around, and she's one of my favorites. I wonder if there's something that will overlap.
She had no personal direct, she had no children, so she's no connection to.
But her niece, this is my guess, so I'm not gonna say this for the world. There's a possibility that she died at the home of her niece, who is in some way connected to William Green. Like, I don't know that Green is her biological relative. Does that make sense? Like, there's some connection there. There's a niece or nephew in there, and then the Greens. Okay, so I am
Final piece.
I'm convinced of your interest and affection for Dorothea Ripley. If that's all right, I might be spreading that all around. Ripley's multifaceted ministry, theologically framed by universal atonement, reached out to the multitudes. While in America, persons of all distinctions partook of my gospel labor, she says, from the President of the United States to the to the humblest person enslaved, persons incarcerated in hospitals and houses appointed for the poor, so that thousands rejoiced in the sympathy of God, feeling love and goodwill to all nations. And she was privileged to be a part of that. And her vision and efforts to influence social systems for racial and economic justice are extraordinary, as she was described at the time of her death. So, thank you.
I want to say that, thank you, really, you were the best speaker we've had. And something I really noticed here is that all the women in our group are women in leadership. And I think that I really felt the spirit that this resonated with them today. I really felt a strong spirit that way, and that was a good thing, I think, as part of this dialogue. Well,
Mike, do
yes.
we have time for just one question?
For you, Thelma, always.
You skipped over being exiled at the age of 19. That could have been one reason she traveled so much, but could you?
So that's her father was exiled from his place of employment and residency. So he worked for a larger house. We worked at a manor, and so he was a part of the labor force. And because he had listened to John Wesley's preachers, at 19 he was expelled from his lodging and his employment, and then was taken under the care of the Methodists. So, but the father's experience, even though it's before Dorothy is born, I think does have implications on her identity as a pilgrim, if you will. She doesn't necessarily use that language, but as somebody sent, and okay, in the Celtic, not that this is Celtic, but Whitby has kind of some Celtic, okay, the primary sources on Celtic Christianity, I realize, like, they're in Gaelic and they're like 1,500 years ago, so this is a little bit of a stretch, but the legends, the stories, they stick. They're so people, we're all enamored by them, and in that area of the country, if there was influence of Celtic nature with Hilda Whitby, to be a pilgrim, to be in exile, the pilgrimage and exile are tandem, right? Like we're sent forth from a space, sometimes forced out, but it's for the Spirit to take hold of us and to guide us. And this wandering, there were all sorts of wanderers, and then they would establish and do ministry. So yeah, so possibly, and I have a quote to end with after.
Okay, you got a
We're
quote?
ending. Okay, from Dorothea Ripley. From Dorothea Ripley, we shall believe with our hearts unto righteousness and show forth his love without partiality. Amen.
Good quote. Well, we'll continue chatting during lunch, and hopefully you and those who are in